"Bobby, it's high time you had a new pair of shoes," said Mrs. Brewster, when she was tying his laces one day. "These are in a frightful state, and your other pair is already at the mender's. We shall have to go to Brown's this afternoon." So they did. Brown's is a very nice shop in the High Street, and Mrs. Brewster has been buying the family shoes there for years, so of course Mr. Brown was delighted to see them. He's a most polite man, and he's always smartly dressed. "I want a pair of shoes for Bobby, please," said Mrs. Brewster. "Black ones. It was 11s last time, but perhaps we had better try a larger size." "My word, he does grow," said Mr. Brown. "He must take at least 12s by now. Let me see. Ah, yes, I think I have the very thing." So he climbed up a ladder and pulled out a box. "I can highly recommend these, madam," he said, as he climbed down. "They're an old established brand made by one of the best manufacturers. They're called Rush-Arounds." "I couldn't think of a better name," said Mrs. Brewster. "Rushing around is what Bobby's doing most of the time. I don't know where he gets the energy." Well, the shoes fitted beautifully, but just to make sure, they had a look at them through the pedoscope. In case you don't know what that is, it's the X-ray machine where you see your feet inside your shoes. Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brewster seemed quite satisfied when they looked through the little window, and when Bobby peeped, he wiggled his toes about, and they looked most peculiar. "We'll leave his old shoes to be mended, and Bobby can wear his rush-around straight away," said Mrs. Brewster. So Mr. Brown threaded the laces, Mrs. Brewster paid the bill, which was rather more than she had hoped it would be, and Bobby marched proudly across the carpeted floor to the door. He opened the door politely to let his mother out first, and then as soon as he stepped out onto the pavement, a very funny thing happened. Bobby Brewster started rushing along the road. He did really, at a terrific pace. "Don't be silly, Bobby," called Mrs. Brewster. "Come back and walk with me." But Bobby couldn't, or at least he didn't. He went on rushing along till he got to the traffic lights, and then, as they were red, he rushed across the pedestrian crossing and down Station Road. By this time people were beginning to look, and Mrs. Brewster was quite alarmed, so she started to run. You know how it is when some ladies run. They make a terrific fuss about it and look rather funny, but they might just as well be walking for all the speed they make. Mrs. Brewster was like that. She couldn't catch Bobby up, but ran down Station Road just in time to see him turn into the cricket ground, and when she followed him there was a most extraordinary sight. He had thrown himself on the grass and was lying there with his feet kicking as fast as they could in the air. "What on earth's the matter, Bobby?" she said. "Have you gone mad?" Bobby Brewster was so out of breath he could hardly talk. It's these shoes," he gasped. "I can't stop rushing about in them." Mrs. Brewster caught hold of one of his feet and pulled off the shoe. She had a little difficulty in catching the other leg because it was kicking so hard, but in the end she managed to remove the other shoe. Bobby was quite exhausted by this time. "Whew," he said, "that's better. It did feel funny when I couldn't stop." "I should think so," said Mrs. Brewster. "When you've recovered your breath, we'll take these wretched shoes straight back to Mr. Brown. Rush-arounds, indeed. I never heard of such a thing." Luckily, it was a beautiful dry day, so they had no difficulty in getting back to the shop, although some passers-by thought it rather queer to see a boy walking in his stocking feet and carrying his shoes. When Mrs. Brewster explained to Mr. Brown what had happened, he was most surprised at her story, but too polite to show it. "Well, madam," he said, "I must say I've not had any complaints of a similar nature, but as you're one of our regular customers, I shall be pleased to exchange the shoes for you. Let me see, they were size 12, weren't they?" "Yes," said Mrs. Brewster. "It so happens I've just had a delivery from one of our best suppliers of children's shoes," said Mr. Brown. "It's a new brand. They're just starting. They're called Fly High Footwear. Perhaps you've seen them advertised." "No, I can't say I've heard of them," said Mrs. Brewster, "but if you recommend them and they look nice, I'll certainly try them." They did look nice, very nice in fact, rather nicer than the rush-arounds, and they were a little cheaper. So Bobby Brewster put them on, and Mr. Brown walked with his customers to the door. Bobby was about to step out onto the pavement when another very funny thing happened. He flew straight on the roof. He did really, just like a bird. Mrs. Brewster was absolutely flabbergasted, and Mr. Brown, who had followed but had not seen anything, asked what had happened to Bobby. She pointed to the roof. "How on earth did he get up there?" asked Mr. Brown. "He flew up there," said Mrs. Brewster. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Brown. "He flew up there," repeated Mrs. Brewster. Mr. Brown was too polite to argue, and indeed he had no chance, for at that moment Bobby tried to take a step along the roof, but instead he flew across the high street to a roof on the other side. Well, of course, by this time everyone in the street was looking, and a crowd started to collect. "Whatever are you doing, Bobby?" shouted Mrs. Brewster. "I can't help it, Mother," cried Bobby Brewster. "It's these fly-high shoes. I can't walk in them. I have to fly." Mrs. Brewster turned to Mr. Brown, who looked most apologetic. "I've never had any complaints of a similar nature," he said. "Well, you're getting one now," said Mrs. Brewster. "Fly-high footwear, indeed. I never heard of such a thing." Then she called up to Bobby Brewster. "Sit on the roof and take your shoes off, Bobby. We'll get you down somehow." By this time a policeman had come up to see what the crowd was for. When Mrs. Brewster explained to him what had happened, he scratched his head. "Well, there's only one thing to be done," he said. "The fire brigade'll have to get him off the roof." So he went into a call box and rang up the fire station. The fire hooter went almost immediately, and in next to no time the clanging of the fire engine bell could be heard. Bobby Brewster felt quite important, stuck up on the roof, with a crowd staring at him and a fire engine rushing to his rescue. When the fire chief heard there was no fire to be put out, but just a small boy to be brought down to earth, he was rather disappointed, but the ladder was run up to the roof most efficiently, with a very smart fireman on the end of it. Amidst the cheers of the crowd, he gathered Bobby Brewster into his arms and carried him down, holding his fly-high footwear in his hands. Mrs. Brewster and Bobby walked straight back into the shop, followed by a rather guilty-looking Mr. Brown. "I assure you, madam," he started to say, "I've never had any complaints of a "Never mind that now, Mr. Brown," said Mrs. Brewster sharply. "We know it's not your fault. I suppose you'll change these shoes as well. After all, Bobby hasn't even put them on the pavement yet." "Oh, of course I will, madam," said Mr. Brown. "Let me see now. What other brands can I offer you? Oh, yes, I have an excellent pair of hopalongs." "No," said Mrs. Brewster firmly. "They won't do. Most inconvenient." "What about a pair branded Walk Straight?" asked Mr. Brown. "Yes, that sounds more reasonable," said Mrs. Brewster. "But what happens when Bobby wants to turn round a corner?" "I'm afraid, madam," said Mr. Brown, "there's no accounting for anything that might happen to Bobby Brewster." Then a thought struck him. "Ah, I know," he said. "I have a well-tried brand of boys' shoes in stock called Marchwell. How does that sound?" "Much better," said Mrs. Brewster. "They'll certainly please his teacher, Miss Trenham. She's always telling her boys to march about smartly like soldiers. Thank you. We'll take those." So they did. And the moment Bobby Brewster stepped out of the shop wearing them, he walked so smartly that people looked and said, "What an upright little boy." Of course, Miss Trenham was absolutely delighted, and from that day to this, whenever he wears those shoes, she always gives Bobby Brewster the badge for being the smartest marcher in the school.